questions on his behalf as the Acting Minister.
I thank the Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Perhaps before I begin, can I welcome back all the Victorians who've got to participate here on both sides of the House. I thought that might go down well with you, Mr Speaker.
Depends how they behave. So here we go.
I didn't say they'd be here till 3:10, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the fact that now more than 70 countries have committed to net zero emissions by 2050, including Japan, Korea, France, Germany, Canada, the UK and New Zealand. And now the United States, under President-elect Joe Biden, will support net zero by 2050, or perhaps even better. Why is the Prime Minister leaving Australia behind by refusing to support net zero by 2050?
The Prime Minister has
Speaker, I thank the member for his question. I welcome the fact that the United States will be rejoining the Paris Accord. Australia never left, Mr Speaker. Australia never left, and not only did we not leave, Mr Speaker, we continued to meet and beat the commitments that we have had
Members
in this
on
area,
both sides.
meeting and beating Kyoto 1, meeting and beating Kyoto 2, and, Mr Speaker, we will meet and beat 2030 as well. Mr Speaker, those opposite, when we said that about Kyoto 1 and Kyoto 2, they mocked us, Mr Speaker. They said the plan wouldn't work and we wouldn't be able to achieve it. But, Mr Speaker, they were proved wrong. They were proved wrong on two counts. That one, Mr Speaker, that we are committed to reducing emissions consistent with our agreements and meeting those commitments, Mr Speaker. So when I say to the Australian people what our government will do and how we will do it, Australians have confidence in that, Mr Speaker, because they understand our track record of performance and delivery when it comes to meeting these challenges. Now, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the matter of net zero by 2050, Australia would like to meet that as quickly as possible, as quickly as is able, Mr Speaker, and that is why the Energy Minister and the Minister for Emissions Reduction has set out the technology roadmap, which is the way that that can be achieved, Mr Speaker. But until such time as we can be very clear with the Australian people about what the cost of that is and how that plan can deliver on that commitment, it would be very deceptive on the Australian people and not honest with them, Mr Speaker, to make such commitments without being able to spell that out to Australians. And I'll give another guarantee, Mr Speaker, is Australia's policies will be set in Australia and nowhere else for Australia's purposes and consistent with our national interests. And you can always guarantee that when it comes to a coalition government, Mr Speaker, we will always act in Australia's interests. Now, Mr Speaker, we have our 2030 target that we have signed up to under the Paris Accords, but I note the Labor Party has not. The Labor Party would rather talk about something 30 years from now than 10 years from now, Mr Speaker. And there may be a reason. Mr Speaker, the Labor Party has signed up to a net zero by 2050 without qualification. Unlike in New Zealand, where they have emitted methane, Mr Speaker, which means agriculture and forestry sectors are not included in their net 2050 commitment, the Labor Party hasn't done that. And, Mr Speaker, some simple linear analysis will tell you that for a net zero 50 based on what the Labor Party is saying, it would require a 43% emissions reduction target in 2030. So, Mr Speaker, why won't the Labor Party tell the Australian people what their 2030 target is?
It's concluded. The Treasurer will cease interjecting. The Minister for Agriculture will cease interjecting.
Speaker, geography, Tanya. Economics is not your strong suit.
The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Will the Minister please update the House on the Morrison government's commitment to empowering Indigenous Australians and the importance of NAIDOC Week?
Can the member just pause for a second? The Leader of the Opposition and the Minister for Health. The Minister for Health. The Leader of the Opposition. The member for McEwen. Can the member for Herbert begin his question again? Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Will the Minister please update the House on the Morrison government's commitment to empowering Indigenous Australians and the importance of NAIDOC Week in celebrating and recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture?
The Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Mr Speaker, thank you. I want to thank the member for Herbert for his ongoing advocacy in this important and key area. NAIDOC Week is an opportunity for all Australians to celebrate and engage with history and the achievement of Indigenous Australians. It's a time for us to reflect and understand our nation's shared history and how we can learn from practices reaching back 65,000 years and to better inform our actions of today. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were the first of many. Australia's first explorers and navigators, first scientists and engineers, first astronomers and artists. The Morrison government acknowledges this, and that's why we are working to empower all Indigenous Australians and ensure that we utilise Indigenous knowledge in developing programs and policies that better all Australians. Last week, the Minister for the Environment, the Minister for Agriculture and I announced the opening of a $2 million grants round to strengthen and share traditional knowledge and practices in respect to Indigenous fire and land management practices. This builds on the findings of the Royal Commission into the Natural Disaster Arrangements, which called for all governments to further engage with Indigenous owners to explore the role Indigenous land and fire management practices can play in improving Australia's resilience to natural disasters and the management of public land. Empowering Indigenous Australians goes beyond the work of our government. We are a partner with the Indigenous Australians and state and territory governments in ensuring that through the priority reforms we are implementing in programs and policies that address the refreshed targets in the National Closing the Gap Agreement. Indigenous Australians must be seated at the table in this decision-making. But we know Indigenous Australians are more than capable of excelling in their own right. This morning I was honoured to visit DXC Technology here in Canberra to launch their Reconciliation Action Plan, a practical and tangible example of how businesses are investing in Indigenous Australians and creating opportunities for individuals to reach their potential. Our role is to enable an environment where Indigenous voices are heard, Indigenous knowledge is accepted and Indigenous enterprises are supported. A practical example of this is through the government's Indigenous procurement policy. Empowering the Indigenous people in key decisions on how businesses are run or projects are implemented is critical to improving the broader economic outcomes. From 1 July 2020, the Commonwealth's value-based target will rise from 1 to 1.2%, and this will sit alongside the existing 3% volume-based targets, and they will increase the opportunities post-COVID. Our culture is as important today as it was 65,000 years ago, and their involvement in the shared decision-making is a strength that our government will take forward. Thank you.
The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why won't the Prime Minister commit to net zero by 2050 when it's supported by every state and territory government, the Australian Industry Group, the Business Council, the National Farmers Federation, AGL, BHP, Rio Tinto, Santos, Telstra, Origin, Energy Australia, the Property Council, the Aluminium Council and the Commonwealth Bank, among many others?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. As I just responded in answer to the Leader of the Opposition's question, the government has a very clear target for 2030, just like we had clear targets for 2020, which were achieved, Mr Speaker, not just achieved, but they were beaten, Mr Speaker. They were beaten, Mr Speaker. And our performance in this area, Mr Speaker, speaks loudly because it shows that since 2005 in Australia, emissions in this country have fallen by 14%. Now that compares to an OECD average of 9%, Mr Speaker, and it compares to 0% in Canada and only 1% in New Zealand, Mr Speaker. So Australia continues to achieve when it comes to reducing emissions. We are signatories to the Paris Agreement, and we have put in place the measures that will ensure that we will meet that commitment, Mr Speaker. And it's important that there is, I think, a bipartisan commitment to the targets that have been set. And those opposite, Mr Speaker, have no commitment to any target in 2030 at all. They have walked away from a target in 2030 because they wish to speak about something 30 years from now, then something, if they were to occupy the Treasury benches, they would have some responsibility for achieving. But, Mr Speaker, Australia also, with national electricity market, as a share of the national electricity market, the generation from wind and solar is 18%. Now the OECD average is 2/3 of that at just 11%, and the global average is 6.5%, Mr Speaker. Australia is achieving when it comes to reducing emissions and ensuring that renewable energy technologies are becoming a lasting and permanent feature of our energy mix here in Australia. But we're doing it through technology, not taxes, Mr Speaker. We're doing it through technology, not taxes. But I note this, Mr Speaker. I note this. Of the many countries that have stated something about net zero by 2050, I note that there are only 4 through nationally determined contributions, that is the proper process for actually having a binding commitment with the overseeing accountabilities. Only 4 have submitted that through the process internationally. Now, others may seek to do that. There are some 34 who have set out some longer-term strategies. But I note this, Mr Speaker, that our government will always be up front with Australians about these plans and policies. At the last election we were, Mr Speaker, and at the last election it was exposed what the Labor Party's policies were and what the costs were, Mr Speaker. And so our government will enact the policies that were put in place that we took to the last election and were supported by the Australian people. But, Mr Speaker, what we will also do is through $1.9 billion in investment in new technologies, we will ensure that we meet all the challenges.
And I call the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how, by taking a uniquely Australian approach to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Morrison government has acted to protect the health of Australians, mitigate the economic effects of the COVID-19 recession and build a recovery plan that will get Australians back to work and our economy growing again?
The Prime Minister. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do thank the member for his questions, and I apologise for the delay. Mr Speaker, on few occasions has Australia achieved as much as Australians have achieved this year. In the face of one of the greatest set of challenges, both from the health pandemic globally and the global recession that follows from the COVID-19 recession that has been visited upon Australia now, we have not seen in this country for many generations a year of achievement in the face of adversity as Australians have been able to demonstrate this year. And we thank Australians for that. And we thank all of those, Mr Speaker, who have worked together to achieve that. Governments of Australia working together, health workers, emergency service workers, Mr Speaker, all working together right across the country, teachers, nurses, right across this country to ensure that we have met the challenges and the tests that have come upon Australians in this year of adversity. On the health front, we mobilised early the national health system, together with our states and territories and the workforce, the Australian Defence Forces, the best medical experts in the world, Mr Speaker, here in Australia, advising us on our process. And I particularly congratulate Professor Brendan Murphy on his nomination as Australian of the Year from the ACT, Mr Speaker. He has done an outstanding job for this country. Mr Speaker, we called the pandemic on Professor Murphy's advice, 2 weeks clear of the World Health Organisation. We acted to shut the borders, and we formed the National Cabinet to coordinate the health actions, in particular in response of the states and territories. Some $18.5 billion has been invested in the health response, and this has meant that today again we can say 0 cases by community transmission here in Australia, as it was yesterday. A new milestone, Mr Speaker, in our path back, in the comeback for Australia from COVID-19. Mr Speaker, that compares terribly when you think about it for overseas countries. We're in the United States, some 110,000 cases a day. France, 60,000 cases a day. Italy, 39,000 cases a day. The United Kingdom, 24,000 cases a day. Mr Speaker, these are calamitous impacts in other parts of the world, but Australia stands amongst a small group of nations that have been able to ensure, Mr Speaker, that we've got the health response right and we've got the economic response right. Our comeback is underway. Australia is opening again. Tasmania is opening up again, Mr Speaker. South Australia is opening again. Victoria is opening up again. And this is happening in accordance with the three-step plan we've set out. This government has put a lifeline out there to the Australian economy, and it's now time, Mr Speaker, as we graduate from those lifeline measures, that we see our economy strengthen, recover what was lost and build for the future.
And I call the member for Jagga.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. In Senate estimates, the Department of Education said that it expected childcare fees to increase by 5.3% this financial year. Why will families face a further increase in childcare fees in the middle of a recession when wages are flatlining?
The Minister for Education.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for a question? And it's a very important question because the Morrison government is investing in the childcare sector, and not only is it investing in the childcare sector through the reforms that we introduced 2 years ago, we are driving down pressure on fees and pressure on parents' out-of-pocket expenses. Now, let's go to Senate estimates and let's look at what the department said. Let's look at what the department said. Out-of-pocket expenses are 3.2% lower than what they were 2 years ago when our reforms were introduced. That is what the department said. 3.2% lower than what they were 2 years ago when our reforms were introduced. And not only that, we're continuing to invest in the childcare sector, and our investment goes up from $9 billion this year to over $10 billion over the forward estimates. And I tell you what we won't be doing on this side, because we don't hear much about it. We don't hear much about it from those opposite. We still don't know what their policy is when it comes to the childcare wage subsidy, and the Leader of the Opposition laughs. The Leader of the Opposition laughs. Let me remind you what Bob Carr had to say about it. One policy was simply bad. He said one policy was simply bad. A government subsidy for the wage.
Member for Kingston. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. As strange as this answer is,
no,
the point of order
the
was—
Minister for Home Affairs will cease interjecting. I've called the Leader of the Opposition on a point of order. That means I'm going to hear the point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It was a very specific question. It spoke about one issue, the 5.3% increase in childcare fees, which is what the Minister's department said would happen this coming year. Nothing else wasn't about. Not quite sure how Bob Carr comes in at anything, to be frank.
I call the Minister. I do need to say, no, the Leader of the Opposition's made his point. I'll call the Minister again. This question did not ask for alternative policies, so no matter how much he might like to talk about them, he can't in this answer. The Minister has the floor.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And now, what the member has failed to comprehend is the full thing, the full statement that was made by the department
Members
in
on my
Senate
left.
estimates. Because, for instance, what they said over the decade was when that number was quoted was that in the last couple of years it's actually underneath that. So underneath what the cost hikes were by those opposite. And not only that, has failed to go to the final point which is 3.2% out-of-pocket expenses have come down by in the 2 years since those reforms have been in place. 3.2%. So why did you leave off that part of the statement by the Deputy Secretary Ros Bactor in Senate estimates? Because it did not suit your argument. It did not suit your argument. You will not comprehend or understand. They've been in place for 2 years and it's led to 3.2% reduction in out-of-pocket expenses. And if you're being honest, you should have quoted the full statement.
Member for McEwen. Member for McEwen is warned. The member for Warringah.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Truth and facts matter. We are not meeting and beating our missions.
The member for Warringah will resume her seat. This is question time. You have to say at the outset who the question is directed to.
To the Prime Minister. I'm sorry.
Well, you need to say that, so I'll let you start again and we'll start the clock again. The member for Warringah.
To the Prime Minister. Truth and facts matter. We are not meeting and beating our emissions. They've gone up by 0.7% over the last 4 years. You've said you will not be pushed to stronger climate policy by Boris Johnson or President-elect Biden. The Australian Medical Association, the Australian Council of Social Services, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Planning Institute of Australia, the Property Council of Australia, the Business Council of Australia, the Academy of Social Science, the Australian Energy Council and over 100 leading organisations and businesses have all signed up to support the private members' bill that I introduced this morning with to legislate net zero by 2050 with 5-year emission reduction budgets. Over 70% of our trading partners.
The member's time has concluded and I don't believe there was a question. The member for Nichols.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the McCormack-Morrison government plan for a safe and dependable transport network has underpinned Australia's unique response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
It's all right, Scott, I got your back. I would like to thank the member for Nichols for his question, Mr Speaker. He understands how important transport is. Coming from a regional electorate, all regional members know how important our truckies are, and we want to thank our truck drivers for doing the job that they've done. Now, when the pandemic first hit, it was important to get a national freight code so that our truckies could go across borders unfettered, so that they could keep those supermarket shelves stocked, so that they could deliver the important personal protection equipment, face masks and respiratory devices that our hospitals needed, that our communities absolutely so desperately required. And so we should thank our truckies at every step of the way for doing the job that they have done for and on behalf of our nation. And there's been some good news in the last 48 hours. Indeed, Victoria, no cases for 10 days and no deaths, and that is very, very good news. Tasmania is now open to all jurisdictions except Victoria and announcing it will join the repatriation efforts as well as the Trans-Tasman arrangements, and that is good news. New South Wales, of course, will be open to all states and territories when it opens its borders to Victorians on the 23rd of November. And that is good news too. And so I say to people out there, be positive but test negative. And if you have flu-like symptoms, indeed, go and get tested. It's so important that you do so. We want Australians to be their best selves. We want Australians to stay well, and that's why we've put in place measures to help our economy, measures to, of course, put the health outcomes first and foremost. And we've done, on an international scale, very well in that regard. Aviation is making great progress on the comeback. It has been so hard. Planes in the air means jobs on the ground, and aviation was hit first and hit hardest, and we have protected and backed and supported our aviation sector. Late last week, on Thursday, in fact, I went to Kingsford Smith Airport. I had a look at the red and green lane provisions that Jeff Colbert, the CEO there, is putting in place to help our repatriation efforts, to help our domestic flights. Mr Speaker, more than 374,000 Australians have returned since the 13th of March, of whom 29,000 have come home on our Commonwealth-facilitated flights. through regional airline network support and domestic aviation network support, we were able to establish an essential domestic network. And that is good, that is important, and we'll continue to support our aviation sector. We'll continue to support our transport sector. And I've done it with the behest and with the cooperation of the state and territory transport ministers. That's what we're doing. That's what a good government does. It gets behind, it backs our economy, it backs our nation, and it supports those workers who need every bit of help.
Time has concluded. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that in August of 2018 he established a Cabinet committee in charge of delivery of announcements? And can he also confirm that on the 30th of October this year he announced a new Cabinet committee in charge of delivery to replace his old delivery committee, which didn't actually deliver?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Policy Implementation Committee of Cabinet, which has been established to work alongside the Expenditure Review Committee and the National Security Committee, these three important subcommittees of the Cabinet are designed to obviously focus the Cabinet's attention on the important national security measures that Australia deals with on a daily basis. Mr Speaker. The Expenditure Review Committee obviously looks forward to the preparations for budget measures that will come forward, and if they're necessary, in the mid-year statement will be handled down later this year, and of course the budget next year, Mr Speaker. And the Policy Implementation Committee has been established particularly because of the extensive number of measures that have been incorporated in this year's budget, Mr Speaker, in particular to ensure that they're being implemented as quickly as possible because they relate to pandemic responsiveness. Now, Mr Speaker, those opposite may want to jeer and they might want to make light of these things, but the Australian people are dependent upon this government, who has had their back from the start of this crisis, as we have responded in a way that Australians have never seen before from a government with the scale of economic lifeline support and health support of some $18.5 billion. These are measures of scale that governments in this country have not known, and that has meant that our Cabinet has been upping again the work rate, Mr Speaker, to ensure that these measures hit the ground. Now, Mr Speaker, whether it's the JobKeeper or the job seeker commitments, the job trainer arrangements, the manufacturing strategy, the technology roadmap, Mr Speaker, the work that has been done on resilience and recovery to ensure that Australia is in a position to ensure that with the impacts of climate change on this country, as the Royal Commission noted, that for the next 20 years the Challenger will be there to build our resilience. All of this is essential to continue to deliver on the ground as this government does. If those opposite want to make light of that process, Mr Speaker, that reflects on them, not the government.
And I call the member for Berowra.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain to the House how the Morrison government's uniquely Australian approach to responding to the COVID-19 recession will help create jobs, rebuild our economy and secure Australia's future? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Berowra for his question, acknowledge his experience in the higher education sector and local government and his strong advocacy on the issue of mental health, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Berowra understands, like we on this side of the House understand, that the Australian economy has been hit by a once-in-a-century economic shock. 1.3 million Australians either lost their jobs or saw their working hours reduced to zero early on in this pandemic, Mr Speaker. Around 600 million people globally have lost their jobs through this pandemic, Mr Speaker, and the global economy is expected to contract by around 4.4% this calendar year, compared to just 0.1% during the GFC. Now, the government's economic support has helped get people back into work. Consumer confidence has been up 9 weeks in a row, Mr Speaker. Consumer sentiment has had its biggest jump in a budget month of 11.9% since the series first began in 1974. And our AAA credit rating has been reaffirmed, Mr Speaker. Now, last week, the Governor of the Reserve Bank made some important announcements about lowering the cost of borrowing and targeting bond yields. But the ink was barely dry on the RBA statement before the member for Rankin hopped on his bike, training wheels and all, I have to add, pedalled as fast as he could, Mr Speaker, and went to do a press conference before the Governor of the Reserve Bank had even spoken, Mr Speaker. Now, this is what the member for Rankin had said, Mr Speaker. The member for Rankin said the Reserve Bank has obviously concluded that the Morrison government has not done enough in the budget. So, Mr Speaker, the Governor of the Reserve Bank at his press conference was put exactly that accusation by the member for Rankin. And this is what the Governor of the Reserve Bank has to say. No, that's not what we're saying, Mr Speaker. The government's strategy is the right one. It would be completely incorrect to draw the conclusion that this is a judgment on the government's fiscal strategy. The government's on the right track, Mr Speaker. What a slapdown, Mr Speaker. What a slapdown. The member for Rankin would be best be advised to leave his bike in the shed unless he can learn to ride it without training wheels.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm the Priorities and Delivery Division in his department he announced in August last year lasted around 6 weeks? And can he confirm his Priorities and Delivery Deputy Secretary lasted the same number of weeks, demonstrating the Prime Minister can't even deliver a delivery division in his own department? Is the Prime Minister noticing a pattern here?
The Prime Minister has the call.
The only pattern I'm noticing here, Mr Speaker, is the juvenile nature of the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the government will make arrangements through the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to support the policies of the government. And, Mr Speaker, on the matter that the member raised earlier, the earlier committee he referred to did not have the purpose that he set it out, Mr Speaker. The Policy Implementation Committee was of a completely different purpose to the one he misrepresented earlier. Mr Speaker, if the Deputy Leader of the Opposition has nothing better to do than engage in these sorts of childish cheap shots, he should look for another job.
The member for Leichhardt has the call.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how Morrison government's JobMaker hiring credit and other economic supports are providing incentives to support Australian jobs and drive Australia's economic recovery?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the crocodile farmer for his question, Mr Speaker. An insurance clerk, a real estate agent, a member of the RAAF now, Mr Speaker, and now a hard-working member in the parliament supporting the members in the constituents of Leichhardt, Mr Speaker. Now, he understands that the Australian economic recovery is now underway. 446,000 jobs have been created in the last 4 months, Mr Speaker. And as I said, consumer confidence is up 9 weeks in a row, consumer sentiment has been up and our AAA credit rating has been reaffirmed. And programs like JobKeeper have supported more than 3.5 million Australian workers, being a critical economic lifeline, helping to keep that formal connection between employers and employees, Mr Speaker. JobSeeker effectively saw a doubling of the safety net, 2 $750 payments to millions of pensioners, including nearly 15,000 in the electorate of Leichhardt, Mr Speaker. And of course the cash flow boost, which has put money in the hands of small and medium-sized business owners, helping them to have the working capital to get through this economic crisis. Now, Mr Speaker, when we approached the budget, we recognised that we needed to move to the next stage of our economic recovery plan. And that's why we passed through the parliament legislation to bring forward our tax cuts by a full 2 years, Mr Speaker, and 11.5 million Australian taxpayers are getting a tax cut early as a result of this side of the House, Mr Speaker, including around 70,000 taxpayers in the member for Leichhardt's electorate, Mr Speaker. And of course we've also backed business, recognising the importance of the private sector to the economic recovery with an expanded instant asset write-off and the loss carryback. But in this budget, there's a key economic measure to support young people move from unemployment and into work. And that's the JobMaker hiring credit, Mr Speaker, which Treasury has said will support around 450,000 jobs, Mr Speaker. And that JobMaker hiring credit will see the government provide an incentive to businesses who take on people aged 16 to 35 who have previously been on JobSeeker. And so if they're 16 to 29, the business will get $200, Mr Speaker, and if 30 to 35, the business will get $100 per week, Mr Speaker, from the government in order to keep those people, get those people into work. And we recognise, by looking at previous recessions in Australia, particularly the 80s and the 90s, that it took a long time to move people from the unemployment queue and into work. And in the 1990s, it took a full 15 years to get those unemployment rate for younger people back to the levels that it was, Mr Speaker. So this government is focused on jobs, and creating more jobs, and the JobMaker hiring credit is a key part of our economic response.
The Treasurer's time has concluded, and I call the member for Eden Monaro.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister, and can I draw your attention back to bushfires? Last year, the Morrison government announced an annual $200 million recovery and mitigation fund to help communities prepare for and recover from natural disasters. Can the Prime Minister confirm not a single dollar was spent from this fund in the last financial year, and still not a single dollar has been spent from this fund in this financial year, despite Australia already entering the fire season? Why does this Prime Minister not deliver on his photo ops?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'll ask the minister to add further to this answer. One of the arrangements for that fund is that when there are other funds that are available to be acquitted for those purposes, then, Mr Speaker, those funds are the funds that are done first. And that's why we established the $2 billion National Bushfire Recovery Fund, Mr Speaker, of which more than $1 billion, Mr Speaker, has been applied to the purposes the member has asked. I tell you, Mr Speaker, when you're responding to a crisis, the only thing that matters is that people are getting the support that is needed. They don't look to see what envelope it comes in, Mr Speaker. What they want is what this government has delivered. And that has been the case through the drought, through the floods, through the fires, through the pandemic, Mr Speaker. On every single occasion, this government has responded in a way that we have not seen from governments, Mr Speaker, in a very, very long time. Delivering on the ground, Mr Speaker, delivering what was needed to see people through. Now, that may not be convenient for the political objectives of those opposite, Mr Speaker, but the reality on the ground is Australians know that we have their back. I will ask the minister to complete the answer.
The
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister for Emergency
And the
Management.
Prime Minister is correct. As part of the legislation, that should be no surprise to those opposite that they voted for it. That within the $200 million, there is $150 million of that can be used to rebuild after a catastrophic event. That can only be used once other mechanisms have been exhausted. Hence, the $2 billion in immediate recovery that has been put forward for bushfire recovery. The advice from the department has given advice that should not be utilised because there is $2 billion available. The $150 million will not be utilised. Those opposite, in fact, voted for that piece of legislation. Either they did not read the legislation when they voted for it, or they are playing politics rather than looking after the people who deserve it. There is $50 million of that $200 million that can be utilised for building resilience. There has in fact has been applications made by a wide range of communities that is being assessed by the Emergency Management Australia as we speak. That is for them to determine what those projects should be, and we have invited all members, no matter their political persuasion, to put forward those programs. But this forms part of the very piece of legislation that those opposites supported, yet obviously did not read the detail of it, and now are upset about the fact they didn't understand how this would be utilised, but in fact does not acknowledge that this government has put over $2 billion just towards the bushfire recovery alone.
The member for Robertson.
Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister please provide an update to the House on the global status of the COVID-19 pandemic and how Australia's unique response to the pandemic compares? And are there any alternative policies?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Robertson, who long before the pandemic expressed a deep interest in immune conditions and respiratory conditions. Sadly, with regards to this respiratory condition and this disease of COVID-19, almost unimaginably, it is accelerating. It is spreading at a faster rate than at any time before. We now know that the world has passed over 50 million formally diagnosed cases, that 1.25 million people have lost their lives, and that means that around the world families are suffering, nations are in turmoil and economies are struggling. We particularly know, for example, that in the last 14 days, every one of those days has seen over 400,000 cases, some over 500,000, some indeed over 600,000 cases. In the last few days, we've had the highest day on record for cases and for lives lost, the highest day on record for lives lost. And what that means is that we stop and look at Australia. And today, as the Prime Minister has said, we've had a second consecutive day of 0 cases, a fourth nationwide day of 0 cases in the last 9 days. And against that background, the world is looking to Australia. And what they see is a nation which took early action, which approached this right from the outset, listening to the science, taking action and delivering on the outcomes. In particular, we closed the borders on the 1st of February on the basis of the medical advice. We took steps to deliver testing results which have now seen Australia have over 9.1 million tests and a continuous flow of tests at a time when so many other nations around the world struggled with their testing regimes. The delivery of that outcome has been one of the most significant in terms of saving lives and protecting lives. The contact tracing around the nation has been overwhelmingly outstanding. Obviously, there was a huge challenge in Victoria, but progress has been made, and I welcome that fact. And then we've taken the difficult steps with distancing. But all of these things have been combined with not just flattening the curve, but also building the capacity. The delivery of 38 million primary health services through telehealth, the delivery of mental health support services, the delivery in particular of 7,500 ventilators, and we are now at 0 Australians on ventilation as of today, I can inform the House, as a result of COVID-19. I thank Australians for what they've done, and we recommit to continue this fight.
And I call the member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Home Affairs has confirmed that despite announcing a mental health national action plan for emergency workers on the 12th of January this year at the height of the bushfires, the plan won't be implemented until halfway through next year. How many more bushfire seasons will have to pass before emergency workers get the mental health support the Prime Minister announced?
The Minister for Emergency Management.
Well, I thank the member for her question, and I'm happy to advise the member that there has been $11.5 million committed to Fortum Australia and the Black Dog Institute of Australia to support emergency service personnel around particularly PTSD, and that will complement the other range of mental health initiatives that we have put out. This is not just the federal government's responsibility. We are working with state as well. Well, just to give an education to those opposite that engage and interject, they need to appreciate that states have always had the operational management of emergency management. They are the professionals. They are the ones that execute and have done an exemplary job, and we should be so proud of them. This is above politics. This is about people. And both state and federal governments are working together to make sure that we have a world-class mental health program for our first responders. And we are doing that with those that know best. Fortum Australia, the Black Dog Institute. We will not resolve from the fact that we will continue to make sure whatever investment needs to be made with states continues. That is our responsibility to the states in supporting them in making sure we have a world-class mental health program for our emergency service personnel.
The member for Reid.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister update the House on Australia's progress in securing and producing a vaccine for COVID-19, and will the minister outline the importance of such a vaccine for our recovery from this pandemic?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Reid, who of course comes with a deep commitment to mental health and a deep career in terms of having provided that support both practically and at a policy level. More broadly, we know that taking on board all of the steps which Australia has implemented and delivered with regards to COVID, there's still no pathway that is completely out of this unless and until we have a vaccine. And that's because, as we set out earlier, as the Prime Minister set out and to which I referred also, the world is facing enormous numbers of cases on a daily basis, over 500,000 on average over the last week. That's why a vaccine is a fundamentally important step. I'm very pleased to be able to inform the House that last week the Prime Minister announced that we had secured 2 additional contracts for vaccines, advanced purchasing agreements. Firstly, with Novavax for their protein vaccine and adjuvant protein vaccine, 40 million units for delivery during the course of 2021, commencing in the first quarter, and secondly 10 million units of the Pfizer mRNA vaccine, and that's also expected for first delivery in the first quarter. All of these, of course, are subject to clinical trials and regulatory approvals, but the advice we have from the medical expert panel, or SciTag, the Scientific and Technical Advisory Group led by Professor Brendan Murphy and Professor Paul Kelly, is that the immune response for both T-cell and antibodies is very positive for all 4 of these vaccines. What does that mean in practice? It means that our pathway to delivering vaccines for next year is growing and strengthening. We have already put in place acquisition for 51 million units of the University of Queensland vaccine to be produced with CSL, the molecular clamp vaccine, and in addition to that, the AstraZeneca vaccine, 33.8 million units. 3.8 million of those will come from overseas, but importantly 30 million units are to be manufactured here in Australia, and of those 30 million units, that process, the first step, begins today. That process of manufacturing vaccines here in Australia begins. There are many steps in it, but this is about making sure we have the delivery commencing in the first half of next year, with an expectation of the first quarter, most likely in March. And what that means is that we have Australians with the potential to have a pathway through this over and above what we've done to contain the virus, but to protect and save lives in Australia going forward.
And I call the member for Griffith.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. I refer to the government's defunct National Water Infrastructure Loan Facility, which was announced 50 times. Can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm that in its last 15 months of operation, $615,986 of taxpayer money was wasted on administering this scheme, which did not issue a single dollar in loans before it was shut down?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
What I can confirm is that we're getting on board with building dams. What I can confirm is that $2 billion as part of the budget, $2 billion, $2,000 million is going to the National Water Infrastructure Development Fund to build dams. And I welcome states, territories of all political persuasion to get on board that journey with me, to build on what we've already said we're going to do as far as big rocks. Oh, here we go. Here we go. The one who wanted to take all the water.
Members on my left, the Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, it's on direct relevance, Mr Speaker. The Deputy Prime Minister is talking about a different scheme to the one that's in the question. He's referring to dams that he hasn't built, that haven't been built during this government, and I ask him to be brought back to the question.
The member for McEwen can leave under Standing Order 94A. Yeah, well, he should have predicted it on the way up here. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call. The question was very specific. It asked him about a dollar figure. I won't go over the question again, so he needs to confine himself to the question and be relevant to it, or wind his answer up. The Deputy Prime Minister.
We are moving from loans to grants. We are, and that's because that's what the states and territories wanted. They want the money in grants, preferably rather than loans, and that is what we're doing. And we're working with the New South Wales government for Dungowan and Wyangla. Now, originally those two particular projects, we had said that we would do it as a loan process. The New South Wales government wants it as grants, and so we're going to build those dam infrastructure projects with the New South Wales as grants. And the difference that will mean to inland New South Wales for the equivalent of 1.2 Sydney harbours of inland water for flood mitigation, for water security for towns, for irrigation, and to ensure that we can grow agriculture from the $61 billion enterprise to $100 billion, that goal for 2030. That's what we're doing right through Queensland, whether it's Emu Swamp Dam and the member for Maranoa's electorate. I know how hard Brent Finlay has worked to achieving the money that irrigators have put up for that particular project. $23.4 million of irrigators' own money, and we've put up $48 million, $6 million of which has been enabling roads. And I welcome to be able to work with the new Water Minister in Queensland, given the fact that Anthony Lynham has retired. I look forward to working with that new minister to achieve that dream that has been on the books for way too long. And we are building it because it takes a Liberal Nationals government to build water infrastructure, and that's what we're doing.
The member for Higgins. Member for Higgins has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister please advise the House how the recent appointment of Australia's new Chief Scientist will support the development of science as an enabler of industry to help drive our economic recovery from the COVID-19 recession?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I intend to take every second of the 3 minutes available to me today to talk about science, because nothing gets me as excited, quite frankly, than talking about science. And we have a fantastic story to sell here, Mr Speaker. Now, on a very serious note, Mr Speaker, this year has been one like we have never ever experienced before. And we have had to deal with bushfires, we're dealing with the COVID crisis now, and quite frankly, it's hard to imagine a year when Australians have ever been more aware of science and the need to engage with our science communities. So now, as we drive through this COVID recession, the role of our science community, the role of our researchers has never been more important. And this morning I was absolutely delighted to join the Prime Minister as he announced Australia's new Chief Scientist. That is Dr Cathy Foley, a very distinguished physicist, applied physicist. She spent many years working for the CSIRO, and I guess importantly, given that science and technology are such key enablers of industry, she has spent a considerable amount of time working in manufacturing, looking at science and technology and how manufacturing can be enabled through science and tech. She understands how important it is for science and research to collaborate with industry. So in her role as the incoming Chief Scientist, and of course she will be replacing Dr Alan Finkel at the end of this year, and we do recognise his work and thank him for the contribution that he has made. But she, Cathy Foley, Dr Cathy Foley, will certainly be doing all that she can to ensure that science is a key part of driving our recovery through the COVID recession. Now, we understand science on this side of the House, Mr Speaker. We absolutely understand science. And let me say two things, Mr Speaker. In the budget, we committed $460 million additional dollars to CSIRO. And quite frankly, we've also committed $1.6 billion more in funding to our science agencies than when Labor were last in government. So they sit there and they try and make out, Mr Speaker, that they are all for science. Well, quite frankly, I don't even think that they would know how to spell
The minister's time
science.
has concluded. I call the member for Ballarat. The member for Barton.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This government spent less than 20% of its announced urban congestion fund last year, but the government committed $10.6 million to advertise infrastructure promises over the next 2 years. Will the Prime Minister deliver on this year's announcement on advertising before he delivers on last year's announcements on actual infrastructure?
The Minister for Infrastructure.
Question. Mr Speaker, we have 185 urban congestion fund projects, and 90% of those projects will be either completed or well underway by the time of the next election, in line with our commitments. I can inform Mr Speaker that $182 million has now been paid. 19 projects have been completed already. A further 15 projects are underway, including 4 commuter car parks. And as I said, we expect about 90% will be completed or under construction over the next 18 months. I know that the members opposite will be particularly interested in some of the projects in their own electorates, which are well underway or in some cases have been constructed already. I know the member for McEwen, for example, his commuter car park at Hurstbridge is well and truly underway. The commuter car park at Craigieburn for the member for Cornwall's electorate is well and truly underway. I know that the member for McMahon is very much looking forward to the $95 million upgrade of the Horsley Drive, which is expected shortly. We've had $73 million go towards the Coopers Plain crossing removal, and a member for Morton's electorate, and that the business case there is expected to be finished by the middle of next year, and construction will occur soon underway, Mr Speaker. The $50 million for the Wallens Ramp upgrade in the member for McEwen's electorate, that will be completed in Q1 of 2021. We've also got $115 million for the Torrens Road level crossing removal in Adelaide, in the seat of Adelaide. I know the member for Adelaide will be particularly interested in that, and that we expect to be well and truly under construction in 2021 Q2 as well. I could continue to go on, Mr Speaker, but these are projects which we committed to. They're going to make a big difference in those local communities, and by and large, most of which will all be underway or indeed completed within the next 18 months.
The member for Bass.
Question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister update the House on how Australia's approach to the development and deployment of new energy technologies will help reduce emissions both here and around the world? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bass for her question. And of course, as a farmer from northern Tasmania, she knows how important it is to have affordable, reliable energy as we bring down her emissions. And like all on this side of the House, she knows that central to that is the development and deployment of low-emission technologies, Mr Speaker. And that's why we have a plan focused on technology, not taxes, through our technology investment roadmap, Mr Speaker, which is a plan to invest in future technologies which will bring down emissions by bringing those technologies economically into line with higher emitting alternatives. It will accelerate technologies like hydrogen, like carbon capture and storage, soil carbon measurement, Mr Speaker, low carbon materials like steel and aluminium, and of course long-duration energy storage. Now, widespread global deployment of those technologies will reduce emissions or eliminate them in sectors responsible for 90% of the world's emissions, Mr Speaker, 45 billion tonnes. Now, we have a strong track record when it comes to reducing emissions, on setting plans and getting on with achieving those plans. June 30, Mr Speaker, we came to the end of the Kyoto era. We met and beat our Kyoto targets by 430 million tonnes, almost a year's worth of emissions. As we look forward to 2030, Mr Speaker, we have a clear plan to meet and beat those targets, 2030 targets as required by the Paris Agreement, Mr Speaker. But not everyone in this place is committed to 2030 targets. Those opposite haven't, because they don't want to admit that their long-term unconditional target requires a 43% emission reduction by 2030, which was the policy they took to the last election, Mr Speaker, the policy they took to the last election. Now, they're paralysed by indecision and division, Mr Speaker, and we heard just a few weeks ago that there was a peace deal inside the Labor Party. But today we read that the member for Hunter has called the member for Hindmarsh delusional. He said those who want to set Australia on a path to slower economic growth and large job losses are delusional. So much for the peace deal, Mr Speaker. If this is peace, I would hate to see war. Members opposite have walked away from their 2030 target. They've walked away from their plan for the Paris Agreement, Mr Speaker. Whilst those opposite fight amongst themselves, we get on with the job.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.